Charles, we've got a very special presentation today. You've made contact. Well, why don't you tell us exactly what it is we've got here?
Well, over time, I've been very vocal about the situation in Ukraine. I'm one of the few people, I think, who's actually been to Ukraine as many times as I have been. You've been there too, Jason. But I've been following with keen interest what has been going on in Ukraine ever really since 2010. And through the course of that activity, I've done a lot of interviews with various media operations, and I noticed this fellow, Oleksandr Dubinskyi, tweeting, and then I realized that the man is in prison. He's a vocal critic of George Soros and of Zelenskyy. He's a member of parliament, member of the Ukrainian parliament. They put him in prison. They've got him in a box in prison. He has to testify in a box. And through his lawyers, we got the opportunity for Crowdsource the Truth to give this person questions which were addressed to him by his lawyer, and then the lawyer videotaped the answers. So we're going to learn the answer. I'm going to learn the answers to these questions live on this podcast. We're going to go through it. We'll answer ask the questions, hear the answers, and then we'll get commentary at the end. But my take on what I've been able to see so far on this man, this is an enormous patriot for the good people of Ukraine. It's a voice that Zelenskyy is going out of his way to silence. The man's in prison at times, supposed to have lawyers. The lawyers have been taken away. Some cases, I believe the story was, his lawyers were supposed to work with him. They conscripted his lawyers, in the middle of this conflict. So we have some good questions.
Sent the lawyers off to war? I guess they died, probably.
One report. So what I propose we do, Jason, is with that background, unless you have more background, we're talking about an elected member of the Ukrainian parliament, one of the chief critics of Zelenskyy, and we're supporting this, quote, democracy, where you jail your critics, you eliminate a religion you don't like, you conscript people who may not really be old enough to fight in a senseless war while you're stealing as much money as possible of his aid money. We're supporting Zelenskyy, have been supporting him, and we still don't know the truth about the Zelenskyy, but now you're going to hear from one of his harshest supporters who, for his criticism, is in jail.
So let's start, Charles, with your question, and then we'll have his answer.
Okay. The first question is, who are Zelensky's main financial backers inside Ukraine, and how much money might they have obtained from the 2014 election through the run-up to the conflict and then during the conflict itself?
Hello to everyone. I sincerely thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer your questions and share my perspective. When Zelenskyy was elected, he was indeed financed by Ukrainian oligarchs, and for some reason, Kolomoisky, Akhmetov, and Pinchuk are constantly mentioned. They probably did provide some resources. Kolomoisky helped with airtime on 1+1. Whether Akhmetov or Pinchuk gave money, I don't know. But people from Pinchuk and Akhmetov definitely appeared on the parliamentary lists of the presidential party, Servant of the People. For some reason, everyone overlooks other figures, shadowy ones, who actually helped and shaped Zelensky's power when he was running for president. These are a certain number of smugglers, that is, businessmen, who were involved in smuggling back in the 90s. It so happened that Zelenskyy is surrounded by smugglers. Few people talk about this in Ukraine, and it's definitely not discussed abroad, but major Ukrainian smugglers are far more important and far more significant sponsors of Zelenskyy than the classic, well-known media oligarchs. I will now name the smugglers who financed Zelenskyy and continue to support him in business and politics, including funding parliamentary groups within Servant of the People today. First, there's Ilya Pavlyuk. His nickname is Chicken Coop because he was involved in smuggling chicken meat into Ukraine in the 90s. A well-known figure in Ukrainian smuggling circles, with lots of articles about him in the press. Initially, the number of deputies he brought into the Servant of the People party was about 65 people. Today, he controls around 40 deputies. And this man is, by and large, a key co-owner of the Servant of the People faction in parliament alongside Zelenskyy. They listen to him, This Ilya Pavlyuk is the godfather of Kaletnik, the former head of the customs service under Yanukovych, deeply entrenched in the smuggling system, connected to the current head of the border service, Denico, and still controls certain smuggling flows in western Ukraine to this day. There's also the smuggler Vadim Slusarev, who controls Ukraine's eastern border. Vadim Slusarev is a notorious figure. He was linked to the son of the prosecutor general under Yanukovych, Artem Shonka, and they were involved in smuggling on the Russia-Ukraine border in the Kharkiv region. Vadim Slusarev was supposed to become the overseer of Crimea from the United Russia Party instead of Aksyonov. He went there after 2014, but it didn't work out for him in Crimea. Aksyonov became the head of Crimea, and Slusarev returned to Ukraine, supporting Zelensky. He is now a member of the political council of the Servant of the People Party. By the way, holds Russian citizenship, controlled smuggling across the eastern border before the war, and controls a large number of officials who are currently employed in Zelensky's system. For example, it was he who brought the head of the state border service, Denico, to Zelensky and got him employed. In this scam with $550 million of American financial aid through the Polish company Lekmar, which I recently wrote and talked about, is the very scam that went through Denico. And where there's Denico, there's always Slusarev. Slusarev is the political father of the Kharkiv region governor, Sinagubov, and many other people who occupy a certain hierarchy in Zelensky's power system. No one talks about these people at all, even though they become new oligarchs under Zelensky. Besides them, the main financiers today in Zelensky's company and his business, and the people on whom assets are registered, are the Shefir brothers, former heads of Kvartal 95, Timur Mindich, also a co-owner of Kvartal 95, and the company Green Films, through which Kvartal 95's products are still sold to Russia, and they still air in Russia in prime time, with the money going to the offshore company Green Films. Timur Mindich is also a co-founder of one of the companies that produces content for the telethon and receives hundreds of millions of hryvnias from the budget to produce TV content that only has good news and no criticism of Zelensky. Among Zelensky's wallets is also Maxim Kripa, an IT businessman dealing with cryptocurrencies, on whom assets are registered, including hotels in the center of Kyiv, in Zelensky's interests. They were registered both before the war, and since the war began, he continues to buy these assets, with the aim of later using them as five-star hotels where casinos, legalized under Zelensky in Ukraine, will be located, because before that they weren't legalized. Yermak, Tatarov, these are characters you know. These are people who ensure Zelensky's power and receive corresponding income from it. Malyuk, as the head of the SBU, Oleksandr Sukachev, director of the State Bureau of Investigation, and Rustem Umerov, Minister of Defense of Ukraine. These are the people on whom the key flows from three spheres converge. The Ministry of Defense, defense procurement, huge money. Rustem Umerov withdrew $13 billion from tender procedures. He controls procurement for this colossal amount, allocated by the U.S. single-handedly. Today, this is the largest income stream for Zelensky and his, I call it, hullabaloo, gang. Sukachev and Malyuk, it's the milking of businesses, that is, opening criminal cases that are then closed for money. In other words, criminal prosecutions of businesses are simply sold. This is a 90s scheme that under Zelensky didn't just flourish, but turned into the key feeding trough of law enforcement structures. Together with Tatarov, they also control the courts in Ukraine and receive income both from selling criminal cases, that is, at the investigation stage, and from judicial decisions through the courts under their control. Ihor Klimenko is the Minister of Internal Affairs. This is the Ukrainian police. The monthly cash flow of the national police is about $30 million, so this is also a major player in Zelensky's scheming system. And of course, Kyrylo Tymoshenko, the former deputy head of the presidential office, the man who was responsible for the media part of Zelensky's campaign in 2019, and then became the overseer of all regional projects of Zelensky's presidential office, responsible for the big construction project, for governors. In general, Ukrainian media estimate his income during Zelensky's presidency at $4 billion. This is kickbacks from road construction, communal infrastructure projects, and from governors through local budgets. Now, the main mechanism of enrichment, of course, is not construction, but military contracts. And I repeat, just recently I published documents proving how, in one deal with a Polish shell company that never delivered shells and rockets for anti-aircraft artillery to Ukraine, $550 million of American aid were stolen. This is a scheme carried out specifically by Todorov, Umarov, Klimenko, and Yermak, as well as Daniko, whom I already mentioned, the head of the State Border Service, and his overseer from the smuggling business, Vadim Slusarev. This is one illustration of how money is made under Zelenskyy.
Pretty heavy stuff there, Charles. I'm surprised they let him send us this video.
Yeah, I'm surprised he's still alive. But I mean, the courage of this man and what he's outlining agrees, it comports with my recollection of what Ukraine was like. I stayed in some of those hotels in the center of Kyiv, and we would be sitting down in the lobby, and these thugs would come in with these gigantic guards with submachine guns. And they'd take over a corner of the lobby, and all these pretty girls would come mincing in and sitting on the laps of these people. And it's a corrupt place, and these allegations obviously need to be studied carefully. But we shouldn't be in a place where you and I have to interview this man, and people in Congress are still wearing these pins and demanding that we send more and more money to Ukraine. I mean, this is a raging inferno of corruption. It was like that when I was there from 2010 to 12. It's only gotten worse. Who are these advocates in Washington, D.C. for giving these people more money?
You know, it was interesting, Charles. We have a lot more video that we're going to go back to in just a second, but he said something in there. I know it was a fire hose of information and foreign names, but he listed off a few different people who he described as Zelensky's wallet. And that's the second time I've heard that. That was a term that was used in the city of Almaty, Kazakhstan versus Felix Sater, describing different people in what was essentially this RICO enterprise whose sole function was to receive money on behalf of this person so that they appeared free of corruption. But this job of being the wallet, I don't know. We need to learn more about it. It seems maybe sometimes like having a target on you, like that guy might get killed at some point who is the wallet.
Well, so the way I understand the wallet is you're the president of the country. You can't appear on a share register as owning 10% of a company. So you say, all right, Goodman, we're gonna make you a billionaire. You're gonna say you own this stuff, and it's really in Zelensky's name. I heard about that firsthand from Imelda Marcos in Manila. The day she got out of prison, I happened to meet her with some powerful friends, and she was telling me about this. That's how they roll.
Yeah.
Under Ferdinand.
No, I have no doubt. So let's go to your next question.
Okay. One second. Of course, my computer's same question, but let's think about foreign backers of these. The Americans, the biggest financial back. Are the Americans the biggest financial backers, or the British the biggest? If not either, who is the biggest foreign backer of Zelenskyy?
Undoubtedly, the main sponsor is the United States. Various estimates speak of $200 to $350 billion in aid that was directed to support Ukraine's economy and armed forces. These funds need to be divided into three parts. The first is the purchase of weapons that are transferred to Ukraine, or the procurement of weapons that replace those handed over to Ukraine. For example, Poland transferred tanks to Ukraine, and the American budget bought new tanks for the Polish army. The second part of the financial aid from the U.S. to Ukraine is contracts for the American military-industrial complex. Long-term contracts that later allow for the supply of weapons to Ukraine. And the third is social support. Recently, in an interview, Tucker Carlson mentioned that the U.S. pays salaries to Ukrainian officials, which is absolutely fair. It's indeed true. Besides salaries, pensions are also paid from the American financial budget, as well as money to the SBU structures, the police, and the Ministry of Defense structures. In other words, hundreds of millions of dollars are being stolen, while Americans continue to pay salaries to Ukrainian officials. I'll draw attention to an interesting fact. Near the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, in Kyiv, several protests have already taken place. In Ukraine, total mobilization has been declared. Men are afraid to go outside, They're being caught by military enlistment office employees and sent straight to the front, because joining the army in Ukraine is equivalent to receiving a life sentence. Demobilization from the army is impossible. You get in there, and there's no way back, and if you refuse the army, you can get 3 to 5 years in prison. Even this choice isn't given to Ukrainian citizens. They're caught on the streets and sent to the army without alternatives, essentially for a life sentence until the war ends. And since Zelenskyy wants to fight forever, it's effectively a life sentence for crimes they didn't commit. So in conditions of fear of forced mobilization, no one in Ukraine goes outside, let alone holds protests just for the sake of it. Any protest near the American embassy that isn't controlled and coordinated by the SBU would immediately end with forced mobilization and those people being sent to the front. Unless, of course, the protest is organized by the SBU itself. So, American taxpayers are paying salaries to SBU officers, and these SBU officers, with that money, are organizing protest rallies against Trump's policies in front of the American embassy. Just think about that fact.
Pretty wild stuff, Charles, but that's the same thing essentially that we're seeing here in the United States.
Yeah, and it's just, I mean, I don't know how much time you spent with State Department people. I've spent some time with people like that. And they have this view. It's kind of like the old multinational days in IBM, where in a big multinational, you knew you're going to be in one spot for 2 years, and then you're going to go to a different spot 2 years later, and 2 years later, you're going to spend a 30-year, 40-year career doing that, going around to different places, bumping up the chain. You're going to be there. Presidents will come and go, but you're going to direct the foreign policy of the United States. The arrogance of these people in the corrupt foreign policy establishment knows no bounds. When you look at the history of our foreign entanglements, it's just corpse after corpse after corpse. And now here we are, for all this coddling of Europe, you know, our soldiers dying in World War I and World War II, and then subsidizing Europe. Here we now have Europe, a fork in the road, saying, you know, screw you, America. With all this evidence, we're going to have more in a second, with all this evidence, Europe wants to pump more money into Ukraine and have more young Ukrainians and Russians killed.
Zelenskyy too.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
Horrible. So shall I read
Question
the third
3,
one?
yeah.
Sure. Much has been made of the Biden family's financial ties to Ukraine. What is your sense of the magnitude of their potential financial gains from supporting Zelenskyy and his Ukrainian financial supporters?
This is a very deep, complex question. In one of the SBU documents, Hunter Biden was named a co-owner of the Burisma company of Ukrainian oligarch Mykola Zlochevsky in 2016. This is one of the largest private gas production companies in Ukraine. Zlochevsky is a former minister of ecology and natural resources in Yanukovych's government. And in that government, he obtained licenses using his authority, getting them for pennies, which he then used for his private company to extract gas, oil, and gas condensate. Accordingly, these licenses were later used to generate super profits. And to generate super profits, more licenses were needed. When the Revolution of Dignity happened, a very simple episode occurred. By all rights, all of Burisma's licenses should have been taken away, and for that, the company needed to be legally torn apart. To prevent this from happening, Zlochevsky, realizing that he had built all his licenses and his multi-billion-dollar gas production business using state resources without paying money into the Ukrainian budget, hired Hunter Biden to the supervisory board of his company, Burisma, paying him $1 million a year, essentially with money stolen from the Ukrainian budget. This money passed through the accounts of several offshore companies. I spoke about this at a press conference in 2019 when I exposed Burisma's corruption, and I think this is just the tip of the iceberg, the most visible part. But what's not visible? For example, Amos Hochstein, a person from Biden's team, was somehow appointed to the supervisory board of Ukraine's national monopoly, Naftogaz, which controls both the extraction of gas and oil, the production of gas condensate, and the sale of gas to Ukraine's population and industrial consumers. So Amos Hochstein, while on Naftogaz's supervisory board, helped the head, Naftogaz director Kobylev, raise tariffs, facilitated tariff increases, despite the fact that the cost of gas extraction in Ukraine is quite low. It was sold at European prices, at market prices, to its own population so that it was possible to collect a huge amount of money from the population and thus increase Naftogaz's budget, then extract that money through certain schemes into private companies and earn about $1.5 billion during Amos Hochstein's time on Naftogaz's supervisory board. And there are actually a lot of such schemes. They're all described in the Ukrainian press, but no one pays attention to them. We should also note that for Biden, corruption in Ukraine became a problem because when he got involved in it in 2014 to 2016, it threatened his election as U.S. president in 2020. After he was elected president, the Burisma issue didn't go away, and neither did the issue of Hunter Biden's employment at Burisma. Today, we know that Hunter Biden admitted his guilt in receiving income from Burisma. We know he admitted to not paying taxes on that income in the U.S. Essentially, he admitted to receiving illegal money from Zelenskyy on Ukrainian territory for political protection. This is just one episode. After that, actions began that were regulated and fully coordinated with Zelenskyy, carried out by his team to discredit everyone who spoke about Biden's corruption in Ukraine. My case was a demonstrative one. After my 2019 press conference about corruption in Burisma in 2021, a few days before Joe Biden's inauguration, so that it wouldn't fall on him as a conflict of interest, that sanctions would effectively be imposed on me for discrediting Joe Biden and informing the public about his corruption in Ukraine. Sanctions were imposed on me. Then on the orders of the acting U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Christina Kavian, I'm ready to confirm this information under oath. The head of the Servant of the People faction in the Ukrainian parliament, David Arakhamia, showed me this on his phone. Correspondence with the U.S. ambassador who demanded my expulsion from the faction to send a signal to the new American administration about the loyalty of the Ukrainian leadership. Actions began that were meant to purge all politicians and journalists who spoke about the corruption of the Biden family. And the sanctions against Ukrainian politicians were initiated by NGOs, his is very important, linked to USAID and Soros, because USAID and Soros here were responsible for ensuring Biden's political invulnerability, suppressing the Burisma topic, and presenting any investigation into Hunter Biden's corruption and Joe Biden's influence peddling as the fruit of a poison tree. That is, the fruit of Russian disinformation.
Wow. Rings true, Charles.
It really does. I mean, I obviously don't understand Ukrainian. I'd love to hear him speak in Ukrainian, but the English version of his answers are superb. I mean, this guy is, can you think of a single American politician who in jail for expressing criticism of a president could put this type of extemporaneous answer? None of this is edited, right? This is just what...
Yeah. He just sent us this, and we're just playing it on the fly here.
Right. It's just impressive. Now, question 4, I think he didn't answer, so I can read it. He says he says he answers it later, so I'll read question 4, but then I think we'll go to question 5.
Yeah.
Right? So question 4, are other American politicians in either party gaining from their support of Zelenskyy? If so, who and how much? Apparently he didn't answer that question specifically. So 5, what roles do nonprofit organizations, real and fake, play in the political process in Ukraine? For example, George Soros and, quote, organizations funded by USAID are discussed critically in the U.S. media. Are there other nonprofits meddling in the Ukraine? If so, which are the worst offenders?
What Musk revealed in his investigation about USAID and Michael Benz in his investigation about USAID, about the $35 billion that were spent in Ukraine over the past few years, these very investments were, in essence, dozens of times higher than what even the largest Ukrainian oligarchs invested in their media resources. The budget of a national TV channel with an audience of 15% of all viewers in the country, I'm speaking as someone who worked for 10 years as a host on one of Ukraine's central TV channels, was in the fattest, richest years, a maximum of $1 billion the budget. But $35 billion, which USAID poured in over 3 years, during wartime, exceeded the budgets that oligarchs invested in their media resources, I think, by thousands of times. That's why USAID, with the help of Soros's funds, which manage their money, gained the ability to fully control the Ukrainian media space. Moreover, this control began precisely with Joe Biden's victory. If we recall history, in 2019, Zelenskyy demonstrated a desire to end the war while Mr. Trump was president. This aligned with logic, and we voted for him as a president who was supposed to end the war with Russia. Starting in 2020, after Joe Biden's victory, an absolute reorientation of Zelenskyy takes place, and he begins preparing the country for war. Literally 10 days after Biden's inauguration, on February 2nd, 2021, through an extrajudicial mechanism of reprisal, imposing sanctions against his own citizens, which is generally prohibited by law, but Zelenskyy applied it in this way. He, a systemic violator of the Constitution and laws, like a dictator and authoritarian ruler, as early as 2021 banned all so-called pro-Russian channels that spoke about the need to normalize relations with Russia. He imposed sanctions against Ukrainian citizens, including Medvedchuk, who was Putin's godfather, and thus completely severed the possibility of contact with the Kremlin. Because the only person Putin would pick up the phone for as a Ukrainian citizen was Medvedchuk. For example, Poroshenko used Medvedchuk to communicate with Putin, but Zelenskyy imposed sanctions on him and thereby cut off that contact because he didn't need to talk about anything with Russia. He needed to prepare the country for war, and a year later, that war happened. Moreover, it happened after Zelenskyy's Munich speech, in which he spoke about the need to return nuclear weapons to Ukraine, despite warnings from Scholz and Macron that Russia might invade Ukraine if the NATO issue remained on the agenda. He still talked about NATO, creating all the conditions for Putin to later more easily justify his aggression against Ukraine. So, the preparation of the media space for this war was led by USAID and Soros structures. They created such a media market with massive multi-billion-dollar influences where money was paid only for Russophobia. That is, if you wrote articles and prepared materials that incited hatred toward Russia, called for war with Russia, called for the oppression of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or reduced the level of rights accessibility for Russian speakers, you got money. This product was in demand on the media market because it was financed by USAID and Soros structures. If you said that relations with Russia could be normalized, that war definitely wouldn't benefit Ukraine, and that war is a terrible harm that would lead to enormous, catastrophic consequences for this country. You were immediately labeled as a Russian agent, cut off from opportunities to appear on the most popular shows, denied access to media resources, and all conditions were created so that your voice wouldn't be heard. For me, as someone who spoke about the need to normalize relations with Russia and said that starting a war with Russia was definitely not the way to go, after American sanctions were imposed on me, my YouTube channel was shut down and my Facebook was blocked. At that time, my YouTube channel had about 350,000 subscribers, and my Facebook had over 1 million. That's how any voices that could potentially foster anti-war sentiments, or at least warn that going to war with Russia and escalating this conflict was very dangerous, were silenced.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it, Charles?
It does sound familiar, and it's disgusting. It's disgusting that these type of decisions would have been made. I mean, that level of expenditure, if it's true, $35 billion, that's a lot of money. Who was deciding that we ought to ship $35 billion to manipulate public opinion, to speed the refugee streams out of Ukraine and the remaining population, the male population, into the meat grinder that the war became? And who was making these decisions? And who is continuing to support this madness? These are people who are psychopaths. They're dangerous.
Yeah. Joe Biden, it sounds like.
Yeah. All right. Well, should I jump to number 6?
Yeah.
Much has been made of supposed Russian collusion in U.S. presidential elections, 2016, 2020, and 2024. But how much of Ukrainian elements, sorry, my computer, come on. How much of Ukrainian elements meddled in these same elections and in the impeachment dramas of Trump? Who are the worst offenders, and were Ukraine elements involved in hijacking the January 6, 2021 protests to make Trump supporters look bad?
Ukrainian interference in U.S. elections happened 3 times. The first time was in 2016. President Poroshenko, together with oligarch Pinchuk, and Pinchuk is what we call a providnik in Ukrainian, meaning a key implementer of Soros's projects in Ukraine, the owner of the publication Ukrainian Pravda, President Poroshenko, Pinchuk, the editor-in-chief of Ukrainian Pravda Sevil Musayeva, and a member of parliament from Petro Poroshenko's bloc in the parliament, Serhiy Leshchenko, as well as the director of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, which was created with U.S. money, Artem Sitnik, legalized in Ukraine the so-called Black Ledger of the Party of Regions, which allegedly contained signatures of Paul Manafort, the chief political strategist of Trump's election campaign, stating that he received millions of dollars in Ukraine. Essentially, a press conference presenting this paper was held by Leshchenko and Sevil Musayeva. This is the editor-in-chief of Ukrainian Pravda and a deputy from Poroshenko's party. Since these were just papers, they needed to be legalized in Ukraine's legal field. And that's where the director of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, Sitnik, comes in. He opens a criminal case and says these documents are authentic. This was a direct blow to Trump's election campaign in 2016. By the way, my criminal case was fabricated using the same template. That is, there's no evidence whatsoever that my press conference on Burisma was conducted in any coordination with Russian intelligence, let alone that it was aimed at improving the positions of Trump's election campaign. There's not a single piece of evidence for this fact. Yet in Ukraine, a criminal case of this kind is fabricated to prove a non-existent narrative about a Russian trace in Trump's election campaign. This is happening right now. It's an attempt to present the exposure of Burisma, Hunter Biden's actions, and Joe Biden's influence peddling as Russian disinformation. And let me also remind you that Yermak passed compromising material against Trump to his American allies, including Biden's team, in 2020, and this nearly became the reason for Trump's impeachment in 2020.
Pretty interesting, Charles. You know, I know you know, but NABU, that National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, that is the FBI in Ukraine.
Right. Well, and another thing, Pinchuk's name has now come up several times. It's important for people to understand that the Pinchuk's husband and wife, through their respective personal pockets, and I think through the wife's foundation, have contributed more than $25 million to the Clinton Foundation. They were involved as early as 2003 or 4 in Ukraine, working together to, quote, fight HIV and AIDS in Ukraine at a time when the Clinton Foundation had no authority to do that. So this Pinchuk guy is a character who we deserve to do more of a deep dive on him. Did he make all this money himself? Is he a wallet? Or has he legitimately made the billions that people claim he has? What is the nature of the relationship between the Pinchuk family and the Clinton family and maybe the Biden family? I believe Pinchuk has also donated to Trump. So who is this guy? What's going on here? And why, in the twilight years of my life, why am I spending so much time caring about Ukraine? I mean, why is Ukraine in the United States national interest? It isn't. But to hear this person, I guess he was a television host, so that explains why he's so good on his feet. I mean, this is mesmerizing stuff. Yeah. And we really need to learn more about this, have our viewers learn more about it, and speak up. Why is this man in prison? I mean, we effectively America has put this man in prison, right? Because nothing happens in Ukraine that we don't pay for at this point. So what's going on with this? How can you stand up on the left and say, we're all for progressivism and democracy and whatever. Let's give more money to Zelenskyy to jail more of his opponents and treat him in this way.
But didn't he say that it was directly this scheme from NABU? I mean, right. He's saying the FBI is saying, Charles, this is all the FBI does, is set up schemes, set up people. They tried to set you up. Valerie Caproni set me up in the court. Andrew Weissman is setting everybody up. January 6th was a setup. Everything with Trump is a setup. That's all they do.
Well, but the FBI, its remit is supposed to be inside the country, not out in Ukraine. What's the FBI doing?
Yeah.
Well,
what are they doing there? They should.
I know.
Question 7, Charles.
All right. What is your vision for a just peace settlement with Russia? After peace is achieved, how will Ukraine welcome foreign investors, and how many Ukrainians will likely return home?
My conviction is this. A peace agreement must stop the war, create conditions for uniting Ukraine within the country. Because the western regions of the country historically gravitate toward Europe, the eastern ones toward Russia, and the center just wants to live quietly so that no one bothers it. At the same time, Ukraine today is not just a fragmented country, it's a country in which three different ideologies exist. I've named them for you: centrist, pro-Western, and pro-Eastern, pro-Eurasian. So, the combination of these three ideologies needs to be stitched together somehow. Zelenskyy stitched a country consisting of these three segments, with war. He stitched it forcibly, because if Ukraine has now become the largest concentration camp in Europe, where men are afraid to go outside so as not to end up in the army, where they're simply caught on the streets and there's no return from that army, no conditions for demobilization, and no terms of service in that army exist. If you end up there, you're there forever, either until you're killed or until the war ends, and Zelenskyy shows no desire to end the war. For refugees to return to Ukraine, a new way, a new foundation for uniting Ukraine, which consists of pro-Western, pro-Eastern, and centrist Ukraine, needs to be created. And what should this national idea be? Probably the idea of building a new country with a new constitution in which there won't be all the lawlessness and corruption that I described to you when I told you how things are set up under Zelenskyy. As soon as citizens realize that their rights are protected, that the person is the center of the state's interests, and that the interests of the person determine the state's actions, then people will start returning to Ukraine. But as long as people are fuel for the ambitions of specific individuals, in particular President Zelenskyy, who today uses Ukrainians as fuel for an eternal war, just throwing them into the furnace to keep the war going, people won't return to Ukraine. I'm grateful to you for the invitation. I was glad to talk with you, and thank you for the opportunity to convey my perspective on what's happening in Ukraine.
Charles, that was really something. Great for us to be able to conduct an interview with somebody in another country in a jail. Well done.
Well, you did a lot of work on this too, Jason, and I think the thing that's interesting here is that, and sad to say, is that had there been a different election result, we might be the ones in that box, and we might not have had a chance to answer questions from anybody. So I found his, I didn't give him, I suppose I just gave him the questions so he had some advance notice of what they were. But that's all I did. I provided the questions, he provided the answers, and now we've done some color commentary. So it'd be good to get this out. And I thank you, Jason, for staying up so late to do this.
No problem. Very good. Well, Charles, that was an excellent special. I'm going to put this out Saturday night, and it's the Saturday night special. He's an incredibly impressive guy. I think you're right. Him being on television, it makes sense. He obviously knows people who know how to do production, and I think they used AI to do the translation. It worked very well.
It was fascinating, riveting.
Yeah. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching. Don't forget you can sponsor Crowdsource the Truth by going to odyssey.com/@crowdsourcethetruth, crowdsourcethetruth.substack.com, or subscribestar.com, or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. You know what, Charles? Yeah, I might just put it out right now. Anyway, everybody's going to see it. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great night.